She looked innocent, until the Deathworld beast inside her finally awoke. The alarm tore through the corridor before I had even finished my sentence. Red light washed over the metal walls, and the pressure seals along Section 4 began to groan like something alive. I froze for half a second, my heart's hammering in 3 separate rhythms, the way they do when my body cannot decide which one should panic first. Then I saw her move. Mira Ashford did not run. She did not shout. She simply turned, calm as still water, and walked toward the failing airlock, as if she had been expecting it her whole life. I remember thinking, in that strange, stretched moment, that this was not how a human was supposed to react. Every report I had ever read about her species said they were fragile, emotional, easily overwhelmed. Yet here she was, tapping commands into a panel with fingers that did not shake at all, while the rest of us stood frozen in the doorway. My name is Vekar Doran. I am a security officer of the Vishari fleet, assigned to the Alliance vessel Aurelane, a ship built to carry hope between our people and the newly contacted humans of Earth. I had been given many duties in my long service, but none stranger than watching over a species my own government still listed as a possible threat, even while shaking their hands in friendship. The airlock stabilized with a final hiss, the red light fading back to the soft blue of normal operation. Mira exhaled, brushed a strand of dark hair from her face, and turned to me with an apologetic smile, as though she had just spilled a drink rather than saved a dozen lives in under a minute. "I am sorry about that," she said. "The seal on this side has been faulty since the last docking. I will file a report so it gets fixed properly this time." I stared at her, waiting for my heartbeat to slow. Around us, the other crew members were only now beginning to react, some still reaching for the emergency handles that would no longer be needed. I looked back at Mira, and for the first time since she had come aboard, I felt something I did not expect to feel toward a human. I felt unsettled. "You did not seem afraid," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Most beings freeze when a hull threatens to open." She shrugged, the motion so small and so human that it almost made me forget what I had just witnessed. "Panicking does not fix airlocks," she said. "It just wastes the time you have to fix them." That should have been the end of it. A minor incident, a competent officer, nothing more. But I have served long enough to know that some moments do not end when the alarm stops ringing. Some moments simply wait, quiet and patient, for the right circumstance to return. Word of the incident spread quickly through the ship, as such things do. My commanding officer, a broad-shouldered Vishari named Orson Vale, summoned me to his quarters that evening to discuss the readiness of the human delegation for the coming summit. The Kren Ascendancy, a proud and aggressive alliance from the outer systems, had agreed to attend talks aboard our neutral vessel, and tensions were already high before a single word had been exchanged. "Tell me about the human officer," Orson said, pouring 2 cups of dark tea neither of us particularly enjoyed, but both of us drank out of habit. "I hear she handled the airlock failure without assistance." "She did," I confirmed. "Efficiently. Almost too efficiently." Orson raised one heavy brow. "You say that as though it troubles you." "It does," I admitted. "Every file we have on Earth describes a species prone to fear, to hesitation, to emotional decision-making. Yet this woman showed none of that. I have seen trained pilots freeze under less pressure than a failing airlock. Perhaps she is simply well-trained," Orson offered. "Perhaps," I said, though I did not believe it. Not fully. The truth was, Mira Ashford had been quietly unusual since the day she came aboard. She was polite to the point of invisibility, the kind of person who apologized for taking up space in a room. She ate her meals alone, spoke only when spoken to, and performed her duties in logistics with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. On paper, she was the perfect example of a cooperative human, exactly the sort of person the Alliance liked to present to skeptical species like the Kren. "Look," we could say, "humans are not the monsters your scouts once feared. They are gentle. They are safe." And yet, there were details that did not fit the picture. I noticed, during a routine safety drill, that Mira never once looked startled by the simulated explosions, while her fellow humans flinched and covered their ears. I noticed that she always positioned herself near exits in crowded rooms, not from rudeness, but from what looked like old habit, the kind of habit a person only develops after learning the hard way that exits matter. I noticed the small scars on her hands, faded and pale, the kind that come from years of hard work rather than a single accident. When I finally pulled her personnel file in full, hoping to understand her better, I found something strange. Long stretches of her early life were simply missing. No school records, no family history beyond a birth registration, a note from the human government stating only, civilian survival record, sealed by personal request. I had never seen a record sealed quite like that before, not even for soldiers. I decided to ask her about it directly, though I chose my moment carefully. We were both assigned to inventory duty 2 days later, checking supply crates in the lower cargo bay, a task tedious enough to loosen the tongue of even the most guarded person. "May I ask you something personal?" I said, as we worked side by side counting ration containers. She glanced at me, curious but not guarded. "Of course." "Your file has gaps in it," I said. "Years missing. Is that common among your people?" For a moment she said nothing, her hands continuing their steady work, while something shifted behind her eyes. Something quiet and old. "Not common," she said finally. "Just personal. Some of us grew up in places that are hard to explain to people who never had to survive them." "Was your home a dangerous place?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though the question felt heavier than I intended. She considered this for a long moment. "My home was called a city once," she said. "By the time I was born, it was mostly water and rust, and things that used to be buildings. We called it managing. Other people might have called it something else." I wanted to ask more, but something in her posture told me the door had closed for now, gently but firmly, the way a person closes a door they do not want slammed shut by force. I let the silence stand, though the questions did not leave my mind. If anything, they multiplied. That night, the Kren delegation arrived aboard the Aurelane, and the atmosphere of the ship changed the moment their shuttle docked. The Kren were tall, armored even in formal dress, their movements sharp and calculated, every gesture designed to project strength. Their lead diplomat, a cold-eyed figure named Tharsk Mulvane, greeted our captain with words of peace that somehow still managed to sound like a warning. "We come in the spirit of cooperation," Tharsk said during the welcoming reception, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Though I confess, some among my people question the wisdom of an alliance that includes a species as unpredictable as humanity." The room grew quiet. Several human officers stiffened at the insult wrapped so carefully inside diplomatic language. I watched Mira, standing near the back of the gathering, with a tray of drinks she had volunteered to serve. Purely, she claimed, because it gave her something useful to do at these long events. Her expression did not change at all. She simply continued offering drinks with a small, polite smile, as though Tharsk had commented on the weather rather than insulted her entire species in front of 2 governments. "Humanity has made great efforts to prove itself a trustworthy partner," our captain replied evenly, though I heard the tension beneath his composed tone. Tharsk's gaze slid toward Mira, lingering there with open curiosity, the way a predator studies something it cannot quite categorize. "And what of this one?" he asked, gesturing toward her with a clawed hand. "So quiet, so eager to please. Is this what your species considers strength?" The room held its breath. I felt my own body tense, ready to intervene if the moment required it. But Mira only smiled wider, tilted the tray slightly, and said, "Would you like something to drink, sir? We have a very good selection tonight." Tharsk stared at her for a long moment, clearly expecting some flicker of anger or fear to reward his provocation. When none came, he waved her away with visible irritation and turned back to the captain to continue his veiled threats about border disputes near human colonies. I watched Mira walk calmly back toward the serving table, her steps unhurried, her face unreadable, and in that moment, something about her stillness struck me differently than it had before. It did not look like weakness anymore. It looked like restraint. It looked like a person who had learned, long ago, exactly how much of herself to show the world, and exactly how much to keep locked away. I did not know it yet, but I had just witnessed the last calm night the Aurelane would ever have. Somewhere beyond our hull, in the quiet dark between stars, the Kren were already setting their true plans into motion, plans that had nothing to do with diplomacy at all. And somewhere inside the quiet, polite woman serving drinks with a gentle smile, something patient and ancient was waiting, the way it had always waited, for the moment it would finally be needed again. I returned to my quarters that night, feeling a strange unease I could not quite name. A sense that the peaceful surface of things concealed currents far stronger than anyone aboard the Aurelane understood. I told myself it was simple caution, the professional wariness any security officer should feel before an important summit. But some quiet part of me suspected it was something else entirely, a recognition, perhaps, of a storm not yet arrived, gathering just beyond the edge of what I could see. I did not sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mira's calm face as the airlock alarm blared around her, steady and unafraid, and I found myself wondering what kind of world could raise a person capable of such stillness in the face of danger. I did not yet know the answer. But I was beginning, slowly, to suspect that I did not want to be the one who found out the hard way. A warning klaxon cut through my sleep at the 3rd hour of the ship's night cycle, sharp and insistent, dragging me out of bed before my mind had even finished waking. I pulled on my uniform in the dark, my heart's already racing, and ran toward the command deck expecting the worst. What I found instead was smoke curling from a burned-out relay panel near the reactor corridor, and a small crowd of engineers arguing over what had caused it. Coolant line failure, one of them insisted. Faulty coupling, another argued. I stood in the doorway and watched the debate spin in circles, until Daniel Cole, the ship's chief engineer, knelt beside the melted panel and went very still. "This was not an accident," he said quietly. "Someone bypassed the safety lock manually. Look at the wear pattern. A machine failure does not leave marks like this." The room fell silent. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. The particular dread that comes from realizing a threat has already slipped past your defenses once, without you noticing. I ordered a full sweep of the reactor deck and posted additional guards, though I already suspected the sweep would find nothing useful. Whoever had done this understood our systems too well to leave careless evidence behind. I found Mira an hour later in the mess hall, alone at a corner table with a cup of untouched tea in front of her, staring at nothing in particular. She looked up when I approached, and for just a moment, before her polite mask settled back into place, I saw something sharp and alert in her eyes, the look of someone who had already guessed exactly what kind of trouble was coming. "You heard about the reactor corridor," I said, taking the seat across from her. "I did," she said simply. "Daniel believes it was sabotage." "I believe he is right," she said, without hesitation. I studied her carefully. Most people, hearing that possibility for the first time, showed some reaction: surprise, worry, disbelief. Mira showed none of these things. She simply accepted the idea as though she had already considered it long before anyone spoke it aloud. "You do not seem surprised," I said. She wrapped both hands around her cooling cup, her gaze distant. "Tharsk Mulvane insulted humanity in front of 2 governments and lost," she said. "People like that do not accept losing gracefully. They look for other ways to prove their point." I leaned forward. "You believe the Kren are responsible?" "I believe someone wants this summit to fail badly enough to risk causing real damage," she said. "Whether that is Tharsk himself or someone working for him, I could not say for certain. But I would start watching the cargo transfers more closely if I were you. Sabotage like this needs tools that are not standard issue on this ship." It was sound advice, exactly the kind of advice a trained security officer might offer. Yet something about the way she said it unsettled me. She spoke not like someone theorizing from safety, but like someone remembering, drawing on lessons learned somewhere far more dangerous than a diplomatic summit gone wrong. I followed her suggestion regardless, and it proved useful. 2 days later, my team intercepted an unmarked crate during a routine transfer inspection, hidden among legitimate supplies bound for the lower storage decks. Inside, wrapped in insulating foam, we found a small collection of tools capable of bypassing exactly the kind of safety lock that had failed near the reactor. There was no signature, no clear owner, nothing that could be traced directly back to the Kren delegation. But the timing left little room for doubt. I brought the discovery to Captain Halden Voss, our human commanding officer, a steady man, with tired eyes, who had clearly been carrying the weight of this summit long before it began causing literal fires aboard his ship. "We cannot accuse the Kren without proof," Halden said, rubbing his temples. "If we make a public accusation and turn out to be wrong, we hand them exactly the excuse they want to walk away from these talks and blame humanity for the collapse." "So we do nothing," I said, unable to hide my frustration. We increase security, Halden corrected. Quietly. We do not give them a reason to accelerate whatever they are planning. I did not fully agree with his caution, but I understood the delicate position he occupied. The alliance between our peoples was still young, still fragile, and a single misstep could unravel years of careful diplomacy. Still, I could not shake the feeling that we were watching a fuse burn down, without knowing exactly where the explosion would land. Over the following days, small strange incidents continued to accumulate, none large enough to draw open alarm, all of them large enough to keep my instincts sharp. A supply manifest went missing, only to reappear later, with subtle alterations. A section of the ship's internal cameras experienced a mysterious blackout, lasting exactly 4 minutes, long enough to move something unseen from one deck to another. A junior officer reported hearing voices speaking Kren dialect near the maintenance shafts late at night, though a search of the area turned up nothing. Through it all, Mira remained a strange, steady presence at the edges of my attention. She continued performing her duties with quiet efficiency, continued smiling politely at anyone who addressed her, continued serving drinks at diplomatic gatherings with the same unreadable calm she had shown the night Tharsk insulted her. Yet I noticed she had also begun quietly mapping the ship, walking routes through corridors that had nothing to do with her official duties, memorizing exits and access points with the patient thoroughness of someone preparing for something she had not yet spoken aloud. I confronted her about it directly one evening, catching her in an unused observation deck overlooking the stars, her fingers tracing invisible paths across a datapad showing the ship's schematic layout. "You are studying the aura lane like a soldier preparing for battle," I said, stepping into the room. She did not look startled by my presence, though I had made no sound entering. "I like to know where the exits are," she said simply, not looking up from the schematic. "Most passengers do not memorize maintenance shaft access codes," I pressed. She finally looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something in her expression that was not carefully softened for comfort. It was tired, and old, and utterly certain. "Where I grew up," she said quietly, "the people who survived were the ones who knew every way out of a room before they ever needed one. I have not forgotten that lesson, and I do not intend to." Something in her tone closed the conversation before I could ask another question, though this time the silence felt different than before, heavier, charged with something unspoken but clearly present, like the stillness of air before a storm breaks. I left the observation deck with more questions than I had arrived with, and a growing certainty that whatever Mira Ashford was hiding, it was not weakness she had learned to conceal. The summit talks resumed the following morning, tense and formal, both delegations trading careful words across a long table, while the true business of trust and suspicion happened entirely in the silences between sentences. Tharsk Mulvane spoke of peace, while his eyes constantly measured the room, counting exits and weaknesses with the same instinct I had begun to recognize in Mira, though his version of that instinct clearly served very different purposes than hers. During a recess in the talks, I overheard 2 Kren officers speaking quietly near the observation windows, their voices lowered, but not quiet enough to escape my hearing, tuned as it was for exactly this kind of careful listening. "The window closes soon," one of them murmured. "Once the second envoy ship arrives, we act before they can reinforce this vessel further." I did not catch every word, but I caught enough to understand the shape of the danger closing in around us. Whatever the Kren were planning, it was not simple sabotage meant to embarrass humanity during negotiations. It was something larger, something timed, something meant to strike before reinforcements could arrive to stop it. I reported what I had heard to Captain Halden immediately, and this time even his careful caution wavered under the weight of the evidence stacking against our uneasy peace. He ordered a quiet increase in armed patrols throughout the ship, careful enough to avoid open provocation, but firm enough to prepare for whatever was coming. That night, I found myself once again standing outside Mira's quarters, hesitating before I finally pressed the door signal. She answered almost immediately, as though she had been expecting company, dressed still in her uniform despite the late hour, her expression alert in a way that told me she already sensed the same tension I did. "Something is coming," I said, without preamble. "I know," she said simply. "How do you know?" I asked. She stepped aside, allowing me into her quarters, sparse and orderly, nothing on the walls, nothing personal on display, the room of someone who had learned long ago not to grow attached to places they might need to leave quickly. Because I have felt this exact kind of quiet before, she said. It is the quiet that happens right before everything goes wrong at once. I have learned not to ignore it. I looked at her carefully in the low light of her quarters, searching for some sign of fear beneath her calm exterior, and finding instead something far more unsettling. Readiness. A stillness that was not passive but coiled, patient, waiting for permission to become something else entirely. Whatever you experienced growing up, I said slowly, choosing my words with care, I think this ship may need exactly that kind of experience very soon. She held my gaze for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before she finally spoke again, her voice quiet but certain, in a way that left no room for doubt. If it comes to that, she said, I will not stand by and watch this crew fall apart around me. I have already lost enough people I could have saved. I do not intend to lose any more. I did not fully understand the weight behind those words that night, though I would come to understand them completely before the following day had ended. For now, I simply nodded, thanked her for her honesty, and returned to my own quarters beneath a ship that felt, for the first time since I had come aboard, less like a vessel of peace, and more like a held breath, waiting for the moment it would finally have to be released. The lights failed everywhere at once, plunging the entire ship into a darkness so sudden and complete that for a full heartbeat, I thought my own eyes had stopped working. Then the emergency lighting flickered on, dim and red, and the alarms began screaming a warning I had been dreading for days. Hull breach, multiple decks, unauthorized vessel docked at Section 7. I was on my feet and moving before the announcement finished, grabbing my weapon from its charging cradle, my heart's pounding in that familiar triple rhythm of controlled fear. In the corridor outside my quarters, crew members ran in every direction, some toward escape pods, others toward defensive positions. The entire ship transformed in seconds, from a place of careful diplomacy, into a battlefield none of us had trained enough to survive. I reached the command deck to find chaos barely held together by Captain Halden's steady voice, calling out orders over the emergency channel, while damage reports flooded in from every level of the ship. The Kren boarding party had struck with brutal precision, cutting through our defenses at Section 7, before disabling the internal sensors that should have warned us earlier. Whoever had planned this had studied the aura lane carefully, exploiting exactly the weaknesses that weeks of small sabotage had been quietly testing. They are moving toward the reactor core, Halden said, his face pale beneath the red emergency lighting. If they gain control of it, they can hold this entire ship hostage, or destroy it outright. I organized what security personnel I could gather, splitting our limited numbers between defending the command deck and intercepting the boarding party before they reached the reactor. It was not enough. I knew it was not enough, even as I gave the orders. Our small defensive force badly outmatched by armored Kren soldiers, who fought with the coordinated brutality of professional warriors, while most of our crew had trained only for diplomatic escort duty, never for this. I led a small team down the central corridor toward Section 6, hoping to cut off the boarding party before they advanced further into the ship. We rounded a corner directly into a group of 5 Kren soldiers, and the corridor erupted into chaos. I fired, took cover, fired again, watched 2 of my own team fall wounded beside me, while the remaining Kren pressed forward with terrifying efficiency. A heavy blow caught my shoulder, spinning me hard into the wall, my weapon clattering away across the floor as pain exploded through my arm. I looked up through blurred vision to see a Kren soldier standing over me, weapon raised, and understood with sudden clarity that I was about to die in a corridor I had walked 100 times without ever imagining this ending. I thought, strangely, of Mira's calm face during the airlock failure, of her quiet warning the night before, of how right she had been about the storm coming. Then something moved faster than my eyes could properly track. The Kren soldier standing over me simply folded, dropping without a sound, and where he had stood a moment before, Mira Ashford now stood instead, breathing hard, her eyes locked on the remaining soldiers with an intensity that had nothing gentle left inside it at all. Gone was the polite, apologetic officer who served drinks and blushed at compliments. In her place stood something else entirely, something coiled and precise, and utterly without hesitation, moving through the remaining Kren soldiers with a controlled violence that seemed to belong to an entirely different species than the quiet woman I thought I had known. She used the corridor itself as a weapon, redirecting a soldier's own momentum into the wall, disarming another with a movement too fast for me to fully follow, even watching it happen directly in front of me. There was nothing wasted in what she did. No wild swinging, no desperate scrambling. Every motion carried the exhausted precision of someone who had done this so many times before that her body no longer needed conscious thought to execute it correctly. Within seconds, the corridor fell silent, except for my own ragged breathing and the distant sound of alarms still echoing through the ship. Mira knelt beside me immediately, her hands steady as she checked my wounded shoulder, her expression already smoothing back toward calm concern, though something colder still lingered behind her eyes, something not yet finished with the danger surrounding us. "Can you walk?" she asked, her voice quiet but urgent. "I can," I managed, though the words came out unsteady. "Good," she said, helping me to my feet, "because there are more of them heading for the reactor, and I am not losing this ship the way I lost my home." I stared at her, still trying to reconcile the gentle liaison officer I had known with the person now standing before me, blood not her own staining her sleeve, her breathing already steadying back toward calm control. "Who are you?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. She looked at me for a long moment, something raw and old passing behind her eyes before she answered. "I am someone who grew up in a place that did not forgive weakness," she said. "I am someone who learned to survive when survival was the only thing anyone around me was allowed to hope for. And right now, I am the only person on this ship who has actually done this before. So please, trust me, and stay close." I did not argue. We moved together through the damaged corridors, Mira leading, with an instinct for danger that seemed to sense threats before they fully materialized, pulling me back from one intersection, moments before Kren's soldiers swept through it, guiding me down an alternate maintenance route she clearly already knew by memory from her earlier quiet mapping of the ship. We encountered the main boarding force near the reactor access corridor, a dozen Kren soldiers advancing in tight formation toward the heart of the ship. Mira stopped us both at the corner, peering carefully around the edge before pulling back, her mind clearly already working through the layout of the fight ahead. "Too many to face directly," she murmured. "We need to slow them down until Halden can get reinforcements here." "How?" I asked. She glanced toward a maintenance panel beside us, already reaching for it with steady hands. "This ship has coolant lines running parallel to this corridor," she said. "If I vent them into the space ahead, it will not hurt anyone permanently, but it will blind their sensors and slow their advance significantly. It should buy us the time we need." She worked quickly, rerouting systems with a technical fluency that surprised me nearly as much as her combat skill had, clearly drawing on knowledge that went far beyond simple logistics training. Cold vapor began pouring into the corridor ahead, and the Kren formation slowed in visible confusion, their sensors struggling against the sudden interference. We used the opportunity to fall back toward a defensible position near a support pillar, and I finally managed to retrieve a fallen weapon from one of the earlier soldiers Mira had disabled. Together we held the narrow choke point as the Kren advance stumbled through the vapor, disoriented and cautious, buying precious minutes for the rest of the crew to organize a proper defense. Reinforcements finally arrived, led by Daniel Cole and a hastily armed group of engineers, who had converted maintenance tools into improvised weapons out of sheer desperate necessity. Between our combined efforts, the Kren boarding party's advance stalled completely, their numbers thinning under coordinated resistance they had clearly not expected from a crew they believed too soft and too unprepared to fight back effectively. Tharsk Mulvane himself finally appeared near the reactor corridor, having apparently decided to personally oversee the operation once it became clear his soldiers were struggling. He stood taller than his own men, his expression carrying the same cold arrogance I remembered from the diplomatic reception, though now edged with visible frustration at how badly his plan had already gone wrong. "Surrender the reactor controls," he called out, "and this can end without further losses." Mira stepped forward before I could respond, her expression calm again, though something dangerous still simmered clearly beneath the surface. "You insulted my entire species at that reception," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the corridor. "You called us unpredictable, as though that was a weakness. I would like to correct that assessment for you now." Tharsk's eyes narrowed, studying her properly for the first time, seeing perhaps for the first time exactly what he had dismissed so easily before. "And what assessment would that be?" he asked. "Unpredictable does not mean weak," Mira said. "It means you never truly know which version of us you are dealing with, until it is far too late to matter. The fighting resumed with renewed intensity, but something had shifted in the corridor, some balance of confidence and fear reversing itself completely. The Kren soldiers, already unsettled by unexpected resistance, now faced a woman fighting with a controlled ferocity that seemed to unnerve them more with every passing second, as though they were finally beginning to understand that the reports calling humanity a Deathworld species had not been exaggeration at all, but simple, understated fact. I fought beside her through the remainder of that brutal engagement, my wounded shoulder forgotten in the adrenaline of survival, watching a woman I had underestimated completely become something the Kren clearly had never trained to face. By the time reinforcements from the command deck finally arrived to fully secure the corridor, the boarding party had been broken, its survivors retreating in disorganized confusion back toward their damaged docking point, abandoning whatever remained of their plan to seize the reactor. Tharsk Mulvane himself was among those captured, his cold composure finally cracking as security personnel restrained him, his eyes still locked on Mira, with an expression that mixed fury with something close to genuine fear. "You are not what your files described," he said quietly, almost accusingly, as though she had personally deceived him. Mira looked back at him, her breathing finally beginning to steady, the coiled tension in her shoulders slowly easing back toward the calm exterior I had known before tonight. "My files describe exactly who I choose to let people see," she said. "The rest of me only comes out when it absolutely has to." As the corridor finally fell quiet around us, the emergency lights still casting their dim red glow across scorched walls and scattered debris, I found myself looking at Mira Ashford with an entirely new understanding, one I suspected would take considerable time to fully absorb. She had saved my life, saved this ship, and in doing so had revealed a truth far more complicated than any simple label of gentle or dangerous could properly contain. "I am sorry you had to see that," she said quietly, noticing my continued stare. "I am not," I said honestly. "I think I finally understand what your species truly is." She gave me a small, tired smile, the ghost of her usual polite expression returning, despite everything that had just happened. "Then you understand more than most," she said, before turning to help the wounded crew members still scattered throughout the corridor, her hands once again steady and gentle, as though the storm inside her had already folded itself carefully back into whatever quiet place she kept it hidden between the moments the world truly needed it set free. Blood still marked the corridor walls when the medical teams finally reached us, and I found myself sitting against a scorched support pillar while a young medic wrapped my injured shoulder, my mind still struggling to process everything that had happened in the span of a single terrifying hour. Around me, the wreckage of the battle told its own story. Scorch marks from weapons fire, dented panels where bodies had been thrown with considerable force, and the lingering cold vapor still drifting faintly through the lower corridor where Mira had used the ship's own systems as a weapon against our attackers. She knelt beside another wounded crew member, a few paces away, her hands moving with the same steady precision she had shown in combat, now turned toward the gentler work of pressing bandages against a bleeding wound, and murmuring calm reassurances to a frightened young officer named Grace Whitmore, who had never faced real danger before tonight, and clearly would carry the memory of it for a long time. "You did well today," Mira told her softly. "Fear does not make you weak. It only means you understood exactly how serious the danger was." Grace nodded shakily, and Mira offered her a small, genuine smile before moving on to the next wounded crew member, working her way steadily through the corridor, like someone who had performed exactly this kind of triage many times before, in circumstances far worse than this one. I watched her work for a long while, before I finally found the strength to approach her again, my shoulder throbbing beneath its fresh bandage. She looked up as I approached, her expression softening slightly with something close to concern. "You should be resting," she said. "I could say the same to you," I replied. "You fought an entire boarding party and you are still working." She shrugged, wiping her hands on a cloth someone had handed her. "Old habit," she said. "In my home, the fighting rarely stopped just because you were tired. You learned to keep working through exhaustion, because the alternative usually meant someone else did not survive the night." I sat down carefully beside her, ignoring the fresh ache in my shoulder. "Will you tell me now?" I asked. "What exactly happened to you, growing up?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands, at the faint scars I had noticed weeks ago, without fully understanding their origin. I grew up in a city called Ashwater Hollow, she said finally, though the name means little unless you understand what happened there before I was born. A series of storms and failed engineering projects flooded most of the lower districts decades before my birth. What remained became something between a city and a wilderness, buildings half submerged, streets replaced by waterways, and no functioning government willing to spend resources rebuilding a place already written off as lost. I listened silently, giving her the space to continue at her own pace. People still lived there, she went on. Thousands of us actually, spread across the ruins in small communities that had to handle everything themselves: food, water, medicine, protection. There were no police coming if something went wrong. There was no rescue team if a building collapsed or a supply run turned dangerous. There was only us, and whatever skills we managed to learn quickly enough to stay alive. What kind of dangers? I asked carefully. Many kinds, she said. Feral wildlife that had adapted to the flooded ruins in ways nobody expected, some of it larger and more aggressive than anything that should have survived there naturally. Rival groups fighting over scarce resources, sometimes violently. Diseases that spread quickly through crowded, damaged shelters with no proper medical care available. By the time I was 10 years old, I had already learned to swim through flooded basements, searching for salvageable supplies, to recognize which plants near the waterline were safe to eat and which would make you seriously ill, and to defend myself against threats that would have terrified most people my age into complete paralysis. I could not fully imagine the world she was describing, so different from the careful, structured life of my own upbringing among the Vishari fleet. How did you survive it? I asked. Truly survive it, not merely endure it. She looked up at me then, something distant and sad passing behind her eyes. By becoming someone capable of doing what needed to be done, she said. By learning that hesitation gets people killed, and that softness, real softness, is something you can only afford once you have already secured enough safety to protect it. I lost people I loved learning that lesson. My older brother did not survive a supply run that went wrong when I was 13. Several friends did not survive the winter, when disease swept through our shelter 2 years later. Every loss taught me something about what it actually takes to keep the people around you alive, and I promised myself I would never lose anyone else that I had the power to save. Is that why you joined the Alliance program? I asked. To finally leave that world behind. She shook her head slightly. I joined because Earth's government offered a path off that world specifically for people like me. People who had proven themselves capable under impossible pressure. They needed representatives who could handle real danger calmly. People who would not panic during first contact situations or diplomatic crises. I qualified easily. But leaving Ashwater Hollow did not mean leaving behind who it made me. It simply meant learning to hide that person carefully, so I would not frighten people who had never needed to become what I became. I finally understood, sitting there in that damaged corridor, exactly what I had been sensing beneath her calm exterior since the very first day she came aboard. It was not weakness disguised as gentleness. It was strength disguised as gentleness, deliberately, carefully, because she understood something my own people, and even the wider alliance, had not yet fully grasped about humanity as a species. You hide it because visibility makes you a target, I said slowly, working through the realization aloud. Exactly, she said. If people know what humans are truly capable of, some of them will fear us enough to attack first, believing they need to eliminate the threat before it grows stronger. Others will try to exploit that capability, using us as weapons in conflicts that have nothing to do with our own survival. Either way, being seen as harmless protects us far more reliably than being seen as dangerous ever could, as long as the danger remains available, the moment it is truly needed. The Kren survivors from the failed boarding party were held in the ship's secure detention area over the following days, awaiting transfer to proper Alliance custody once the summit crisis had been fully resolved. I visited the detention area once, curious to hear how Tharsk Mulvane himself was processing the failure of his carefully planned operation. I found him seated quietly in his cell, his earlier arrogance visibly diminished, though a stubborn edge of pride still lingered in his posture. He looked up when I entered, his expression guarded. "Come to gloat?" he asked. "Come to understand," I corrected. "You clearly researched this ship's defenses extensively before your attack. How did you fail to account for someone like Mira Ashford? Tharsk's jaw tightened slightly. Our intelligence reports described her as an unremarkable logistics officer, he admitted. No combat training on record. No history of violence. We had no reason to expect resistance beyond standard security personnel. That is precisely the point you failed to grasp, I said. Her file was accurate. She has no combat training on record, because the place that trained her did not issue records. It simply issued survivors, or it issued nothing at all. Tharsk said nothing for a long moment, his eyes distant, clearly replaying the battle in his mind, searching for the moment his careful plan had truly begun unraveling. We underestimated an entire species based on the calmest examples they chose to present to us, he finally admitted, more to himself than to me. That was our mistake. It was, I agreed. And I suspect it is a mistake many species across this alliance will need to avoid repeating, before humanity's patience runs out entirely. I left the detention area with much to consider, my earlier assumptions about humanity thoroughly dismantled and rebuilt into something far more complex, and, admittedly, more respectful than before. The crew of the Aurelane spent the following days recovering from the attack, repairing damaged sections of the ship, and processing the trauma of an assault none of us had fully expected, despite the mounting warnings beforehand. Mira returned to her quiet duties in logistics almost immediately, her polite smile and gentle demeanor sliding back into place with practiced ease, as though the fierce, controlled fighter from that corridor battle had simply folded herself carefully away again, waiting patiently for whatever future moment might require her return. Yet something had changed between us, an understanding that had not existed before, quiet acknowledgement passing between us whenever our paths crossed in the corridors, the recognition of two people who had faced real danger together and survived it through mutual trust. I found myself watching her differently after that, no longer with suspicion or unease, but with something closer to genuine respect, and perhaps even a small measure of protective concern for the burden she carried so quietly beneath her carefully maintained calm. I began to understand that the true strength of humanity was not the violence they were capable of unleashing when truly threatened, but the remarkable discipline required to keep that violence contained, day after day, choosing gentleness deliberately, rather than being forced into it by weakness. It was a lesson I suspected the wider alliance still needed to learn, and one I now carried with me every time I looked at the quiet, unassuming humans serving alongside us, wondering what depths of strength and sacrifice hid so carefully behind their calm, ordinary smiles. The summons came sooner than I expected, delivered by a stern-faced aide barely an hour after the final repairs to the Aurelane had been completed. The Alliance Council wished to convene an emergency session regarding the events of the failed Kren boarding, and my presence had been specifically requested as the senior security officer who witnessed the engagement firsthand. I felt my stomach tighten as I made my way toward the main conference hall, already sensing that this meeting would carry consequences reaching far beyond a simple after-action report. The conference hall was crowded when I arrived, representatives from a dozen member species seated around the long curved table, their expressions ranging from concern to poorly hidden alarm. Captain Halden sat near the head of the table, his posture rigid with barely controlled tension, and beside him, looking smaller than usual amid the gathered dignitaries, sat Mira Ashford, called forward as the human officer directly responsible for repelling the attack. Counselor Yeshin Torvix, an elder representative from a cautious species known for their careful, methodical approach to alliance matters, opened the session with a question that immediately revealed the true purpose of this gathering. "We have reviewed the security footage from the recent attack," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. Officer Ashford's combat performance exceeded anything documented in humanity's official threat assessment by a considerable margin. The Council believes this discrepancy requires serious discussion regarding humanity's proper classification within our Alliance threat registry. A murmur passed through the gathered representatives, and I saw Mira's expression tighten almost imperceptibly, though she otherwise remained perfectly composed, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the weight of every gaze now fixed upon her. "With respect, Counselor," I said, standing before I had fully decided to speak, "the discrepancy exists because Officer Ashford chose restraint until circumstances left her no other option. That choice should be viewed as evidence of humanity's discipline, not as justification for reclassifying an entire species as a greater threat. Yashan turned her attention toward me, her expression unreadable. You witnessed the engagement directly, Officer Doran. Do you believe humanity's true capabilities have been significantly understated in our current records? I considered my answer carefully, aware that whatever I said next would carry real consequences. I believe humanity's capabilities were accurately understated by humanity themselves, I said finally, and I believe that was a deliberate, wise choice rather than deception. Officer Ashford did not lie about her abilities. She simply chose not to advertise them, because doing so would have made her, and by extension her entire species, a greater target for exactly the kind of aggression we witnessed from the Kren. Another representative, a sharp-featured diplomat from a species with a long history of tension with the Kren ascendancy, leaned forward with obvious interest. Are you suggesting humanity deliberately conceals its true strength as a survival strategy? He asked. I am suggesting exactly that, I said, and I believe it has served them well. Reclassifying humanity as a greater threat would only invite the very aggression this classification system was designed to prevent. It would tell every hostile power in this alliance that humans are dangerous enough to eliminate preemptively, rather than allies capable of protecting themselves and their neighbors when genuinely necessary. The council chamber fell into thoughtful silence, several representatives exchanging quiet glances as they considered the implications of my argument. Finally, Yashan turned her attention directly toward Mira, addressing her for the first time since the session began. Officer Ashford, she said, what would you have this council do with the knowledge we now possess regarding your capabilities? Mira rose slowly to her feet, and I recognized immediately the same careful calm she had shown at the diplomatic reception weeks ago. The deliberate softness she chose to present even now, standing before an entire council debating her species' future. I would ask you to consider what purpose reclassification actually serves, she said, her voice steady and clear. If you raise our threat designation, you do not make this alliance safer. You simply make humanity a more attractive target for those who fear strength more than they respect peace. My people did not choose the difficult history that shaped us. We chose only what to do with it, and we chose partnership, cooperation, and restraint whenever those choices remained available to us. And when they are not available, Yashan asked quietly, when restraint is no longer an option. Mira met her gaze steadily. Then you will see exactly what you saw in that corridor, she said. But I would ask this council to trust that we understand the difference between necessary defense and unnecessary aggression, because that understanding is precisely what has kept my species intact, through circumstances that would have destroyed most others entirely. The debate continued for nearly 2 more hours, representatives raising concerns and counter-arguments, weighing the political implications of the decision against the practical realities the recent attack had revealed. I spoke several more times throughout the session, adding what context I could from my own observations, while Halden offered his perspective as someone who had commanded human officers for years, without ever fully realizing the depth of resilience they carried quietly within them. In the end, the Council reached a careful compromise, declining to formally reclassify humanity's threat designation, but quietly updating internal alliance protocols to ensure human officers received appropriate recognition and support during future high-risk assignments, without publicly advertising the true extent of their capabilities to the wider galactic community. It was not a perfect resolution, but it was, I believed, the wisest outcome available given the delicate balance the Alliance needed to maintain. Mira found me afterward in a quiet observation lounge overlooking the stars, the same kind of room where I had once confronted her about mapping the ship's corridors, like someone preparing for battle. She looked tired, the weight of the council session still visible in her posture, though relief had softened some of the tension from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said simply, settling into the seat beside mine, "for what you said in there." "I only spoke the truth as I understood it," I replied. "Not everyone would have understood it the way you did," she said. "Most people see strength and assume it needs to be either feared or controlled. You saw it and decided it deserved trust instead. That matters more than you probably realize." I considered her words carefully, watching the distant stars drift past the observation window. "May I ask you something?" I said finally. She nodded, waiting. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. "Carrying that strength quietly, hiding it beneath gentleness, day after day. Does it ever feel like a burden rather than a choice? She was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to everything else. Sometimes, she admitted, it would certainly be simpler to simply be exactly what people expect, whichever version that happens to be, but I think the real strength was never the fighting itself. Anyone desperate enough or trained enough can learn to fight. The real strength is choosing gentleness every single day, even when you know exactly how easily you could choose otherwise. That choice is what actually makes it mean something. I found myself smiling slightly, an expression I did not often allow myself during serious conversations. I think, I said, that is the most unsettling thing about your species. Not the beast hiding beneath the surface, but the discipline required to keep choosing peace over it, again and again, without anyone ever fully appreciating the effort that choice requires. She smiled back at me then, a real smile, warmer than any polite expression I had seen her offer during her months aboard the Aurelane. Perhaps that is exactly why we hide it, she said. Not because we are ashamed of what we can become, but because the choosing matters more to us than the capability ever could. In the weeks that followed, the Aurelane completed its repairs and resumed its diplomatic mission, carrying forward the fragile alliance between our peoples with a newfound understanding that had not existed before the attack. The crew began quietly adopting a small emblem among themselves, a stylized wave rising gently before settling back into calm water, a private acknowledgement of the lesson Mira Ashford had taught us all without ever intending to teach it at all. I continued serving alongside her in the months that followed, watching her navigate diplomatic gatherings with the same quiet grace she always had, serving drinks and offering polite smiles to representatives who had no idea what truly rested beneath her calm exterior. Only now, I understood that her gentleness was not the absence of strength, but its most disciplined expression, chosen deliberately, maintained carefully, and set aside only when the world around her left no other honorable option remaining. I had once believed, like so many others across the Alliance, that humanity survived their brutal, unforgiving homeworld through simple luck, or perhaps through some fortunate combination of adaptability and resilience that happened to work in their favor. I understood now that survival was never the true achievement worth admiring. The true achievement, the thing that made humanity genuinely remarkable among all the species I had encountered across my long years of service, was their unwavering choice to remain gentle, despite everything their world had taught them about strength. That choice, quiet and constant, and almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look for it, remained the most powerful thing I had ever witnessed in all my years traveling among the stars. And somewhere beneath the calm, polite surface of every human I would ever meet afterward, I found myself wondering, with a mixture of respect and quiet unease, exactly what depths of strength and sacrifice waited patiently, ready to awaken the moment gentleness alone was no longer enough to keep the people they loved safe.